The wind across Blackwood Moor didn't just blow, it screamed. It whipped through the cracked ribcage of the ruined chapel, carrying the iron scent of fresh blood and wet fur. Arthur pressed his massive, midnight black wolf frame against the crumbling stone, his golden eyes locked on the shadow hiding in the altar's crypt. The rogue. The thing that had been killing his livestock and evading his guards for 3 full moons. With a deafening roar, Arthur lunged. He hit the shadow hard, claws sinking into muscle, slamming the intruder into the dirt. He bared his fangs, ready to snap the rogue's neck and end the threat to his pack once and for all. But the rogue didn't whimper. Instead, a pair of striking ice-blue eyes stared back at him through the dark, eyes that belonged to a woman, shifting from wolf to human beneath his weight. And when her bare shoulder brushed against his fur, a violent, agonizing jolt of lightning shot straight to Arthur's heart. The bond. The fated mate bond he had waited 10 years for, and she was wearing the forbidden crest of the Winterborn pack, branded onto her collarbone. Chapter 1. The Blood on the Moor. The wind across Blackwood Moor didn't just blow, it screamed. It whipped through the cracked stone ribcage of the ruined chapel, carrying the sharp, iron scent of fresh blood and wet fur. Outside, the Scottish Highlands were swallowed by a dense, freezing fog, but inside the ruins the atmosphere was suffocatingly hot. Arthur pressed his massive, midnight black wolf frame against a crumbling pillar. His golden eyes were locked onto the shadow hiding beneath the collapsed altar. The rogue. For 3 full moons, this creature had slipped past his borders. It had slaughtered livestock, evaded his best trackers, and left his pack living in a state of constant paranoid terror. As the newly crowned alpha of the Blackwood pack, the burden of their safety sat heavily on Arthur's shoulders. His elders whispered that he was too weak, that his failing family estate was a sign of a cursed alpha bloodline. Tonight he would prove them wrong. Tonight, he would paint the moor with the rogue's blood. The shadow shifted. A low, gravelly growl echoed from the darkness, a sound so wild, so fiercely defiant, it made the fur on Arthur's neck stand on end. Arthur didn't hesitate. With a deafening roar that shook the loose mortar from the stone walls, he lunged. He hit the shadow hard. His massive paws slammed into a surprisingly lean, muscular torso, driving the rogue into the dirt. Arthur bared his fangs, his jaws inches from the rogue's throat, ready to snap it and end the threat to his pack once and for all. But the rogue didn't whimper. The rogue didn't beg. Instead, a pair of striking ice-blue eyes stared back at him through the dark. Arthur froze. The wolf beneath him was shifting. The thick silver-gray fur receded into pale, blood-smattered skin. The snout shortened into a sharp, aristocratic jawline, and long, tangled dark hair spilled across the dirt. It was a woman. She was panting, her ribs heaving, a deep gash bleeding heavily on her thigh. Yet, even pinned beneath a 700-pound alpha wolf, her blue eyes blazed with pure, unadulterated hatred. She gripped Arthur's thick forearms with clawed hands, trying to push him off. Then, her bare shoulder brushed against the sensitive skin of his inner foreleg. A violent, agonizing jolt of electricity shot straight through Arthur's fur and directly into his heart. The bond. Arthur gasped, his wolf form shuddering as a wave of overwhelming possessive warmth crashed through his veins. It was the fated mate bond. The sacred mythical connection he had waited 10 years to feel. His inner wolf roared in recognition, demanding he protect her, lick her wounds and claim her. But as the euphoria hit him, his golden eyes flicked down to her collarbone. There, stark against her pale skin, was a jagged, raised scar. It wasn't an accident, it was a brand. A brand of a howling wolf encircled by frost. The crest of the Winterborn. Arthur's blood ran entirely cold. The Winterborn were a myth. A savage, bloodthirsty pack, believed to have been completely wiped out by Arthur's own grandfather a century ago. According to Blackwood lore, they were monsters. Abominations. The ancient pack scrolls dictated that if a Winterborn ever set foot on Blackwood land, it was an omen of the apocalypse, and they were to be burned alive without trial. "Get off me, Blackwood dog," the woman hissed, her voice a rough, sultry rasp that sent another unwanted shiver down his spine. In the distance, the sharp sound of baying hounds cut through the howling wind. "Alpha Arthur!" a voice shouted through the fog. It was Thomas, his fiercely traditional beta, leading a dozen heavily armed pack warriors. "We found the rogue's trail," They're headed toward the ruins. The sound of heavy boots crunching on the frozen heather grew closer. They had silver chains. They had torches. If they found her here, they would tear her apart. Arthur looked down at the woman who was meant to be his divine match, and his pack's ultimate enemy. "If you make a sound," Arthur growled, shifting back into his human form in a seamless, fluid motion, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as he grabbed a discarded cloak, "I will let them kill you." He threw the cloak over her naked body, grabbed her by the arm and dragged her into the deepest, darkest recess of the chapel's crypt, just as the torches illuminated the entrance. Chapter 2: Cold Bargains. The air inside the crypt tasted of centuries-old dust and damp rot. Arthur pressed Gwen flat against the freezing stone wall, his massive body shielding her from view. His hand was clamped tightly over her mouth, her lips were hot against his palm, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that fanned across his skin. Outside, the chapel ruins flooded with orange torchlight. Heavy boots crunched over the shattered slate tiles just feet above their heads. "He's not here," Thomas's gruff voice echoed, tight with frustration. "The scent ends at the altar. There's blood, fresh blood." "Did the Alpha kill it?" another warrior asked, the rattle of silver chains clinking like a death knell in the quiet night. "If he did, he would have called us," Thomas muttered, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Arthur is young. He wants to prove he can handle the Moors alone, like his grandfather did. Search the perimeter. If that rogue is bleeding, it won't get far in this fog." Beneath Arthur's grip, Gwen didn't freeze in terror. Instead, her body wired with tension. Her ice-blue eyes glared up at him through the darkness, sharp as daggers. Slowly, deliberately, she bared her teeth and bit down, hard, into the meat of his palm. Arthur swallowed a groan, his jaw clenching so tight his teeth ground together. He didn't pull his hand away. He couldn't. The phantom lightning of the mating bond was still pulsing between them, making every touch feel like an electric burn. He could feel the rapid, frantic thumping of her heart against his chest, mimicking his own. "Control it," he commanded his inner wolf, which was currently scratching at the surface, desperate to wrap itself around her to keep her warm. "She is a winterborn. She is death." Above them, the footsteps finally faded, drifting out into the howling wind of the moors. Arthur pulled his hand back, glaring down at the bloody imprint of her teeth on his skin. "You have a habit of biting the only person keeping you alive." Gwen spat the taste of his blood onto the dirt floor. She pulled the heavy wool cloak tighter around her shoulders, though she refused to shrink away from him. "I didn't ask for your protection, Blackwood. And I certainly don't need it from a man who trembles when his own pups bark." "Those pups have silver-tipped spears and orders to burn you on sight," Arthur hissed, stepping back to give himself space, though the sudden lack of her warmth felt like a physical ache. "Do you have any idea what you are? What that brand on your collarbone means to my people?" Gwen let out a cold, humorless laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across stone. "I know exactly what I am. I am the last thing your grandfather failed to kill. And if you think I'm afraid of your pathetic little pack, you're as foolish as the elders who whisper behind your back." Arthur's golden eyes flashed in the dark. The insult hit too close to home. "You trespass on my lands. You slaughter my cattle. You bring terror to my borders, and you expect me to show mercy? I haven't touched your damn cows," Gwen snapped, her voice dropping into a fierce, deadly whisper. She took a step toward him, ignoring the heavy bleeding from the gash on her thigh. "I'm tracking the same thing that's killing them. And if you were half the alpha you claim to be, you'd realize that whatever is hunting on these moors isn't a wolf at all." Before Arthur could demand an answer, a sound rent the night. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the baying of Thomas's hounds. It was a piercing, unnatural shriek that echoed across the moor, a sound that vibrated with ancient dark magic. It was followed immediately by the desperate, horrified screams of Arthur's men. The hunt had just become the hunted. Chapter 3: The Unholy Alliance. The shriek that tore through the night didn't sound human, and it didn't sound like a wolf. It was a wet, grating sound, like iron dragging over bone. Arthur didn't think. He surged out of the crypt, his boots skidding on the damp moss of the chapel floor, with Gwen running tight at his heels. Outside, the thick fog had turned into a nightmare. The orange glow of the torches lay scattered on the ground, hissing against the damp heather. 3 of Arthur's warriors were down, their silver chains tangled uselessly around them. Thomas was on his knees, his shoulder bleeding heavily, his claws bared as he snarled at the mist. "Alpha!" Thomas choked out, spitting blood. It came from the sky. It's too fast." A shadow dropped from the ruined archway above. It was massive, moving on all fours, but its limbs were unnaturally long and skeletal. Its skin was the color of a bruised corpse, devoid of fur, and its face was a horrific, featureless mask, save for a jaw that split open too wide, lined with jagged, needle-like teeth. The beast lunged directly for Thomas's throat. Arthur roared, shifting into his midnight black wolf mid-air. He slammed into the creature's flank, throwing it off course, but touching the thing felt wrong. Its flesh was ice-cold and slick with a foul-smelling black ooze. The creature whipped its head around, its blind face turning toward Arthur, and let out that agonizing, high-pitched screech. With terrifying speed, it lashed out. Long, obsidian claws tore across Arthur's chest. The pain was immediate, burning like liquid fire, throwing him backward into the dirt. He struggled to get to his feet, his vision blurring as the black ooze from the creature's claws began to seep into his veins. Poison. The beast reared back, ready to drive its claws through Arthur's skull. Suddenly, a blur of silver-gray fur exploded from the fog. Gwen, in her massive wolf form, hit the creature like a battering ram. She didn't fight like the disciplined Blackwood warriors, she fought with absolute chaotic savagery. She clamped her jaws shut on the monster's throat, twisting her entire body weight to rip a chunk of the black flesh away. The creature shrieked, flailing wildly, throwing Gwen off and sending her crashing into a stone pillar. But the distraction was enough. Arthur forced his paralyzed limbs to move, lunging forward to drive his jaws into the back of the creature's neck, severing its spine. With a final, sickening crunch, the monster went limp, dissolving into a pool of foul, black liquid that hissed as it sank into the earth. Silence returned to the moor, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors. Arthur shifted back into his human form, clutching his bleeding chest, his heart hammering against his ribs. Across the clearing, Gwen shifted back too, leaning heavily against the stone pillar, her ice-blue eyes fixed on him, her breath hitching in pain. What was that?" Thomas wheezed, staggering to his feet, his eyes wide with horror. He looked from the black stain on the ground to Arthur, and then finally, his gaze locked onto Gwen. He saw the jagged brand of the winter-born on her collarbone. An abomination. Thomas breathed, his shock turning into instant blinding rage. He drew his silver-tipped dagger. "A winter-born rogue, she brought this curse to our lands. Alpha, move aside, let me slide her throat." "Stand down, Thomas," Arthur roared, his voice booming with the full, unyielding authority of an alpha. The sheer force of his command made the remaining warriors drop to their knees, their wolves submitting instantly. Thomas vibrated with fury, his dagger trembling, but he couldn't fight the alpha's command. "She is a monster, Arthur. Your grandfather." "My grandfather is dead, and so are 3 of our men," Arthur snapped, his chest heaving as he stared down his beta. "Look at the ground. That thing wasn't brought by her. She fought it. She saved my life." Arthur turned to Gwen. The mating bond was screaming at him, a desperate pull to pull her into his arms, to heal her wounds. He forced his face to remain a mask of cold stone. "You said you were tracking it," Arthur said, his voice carrying over the howling wind. "You said you know what it is." Gwen wiped a smear of black blood from her lip, her expression fiercely proud despite her injuries. "I know how to kill them. And I know there are more coming, a whole pack of them, driven by a malice your soft, castle-dwelling wolves can't even fathom." Arthur took a deep breath, knowing the choice he was about to make would change everything. If his pack found out, they would call it treason. But looking at his bleeding men, he knew he had no choice. "A bargain, then," Arthur said, stepping between Gwen and his warriors. "Help me hunt these things down. Protect my borders. Do this, and I will grant you asylum within Blackwood Keep. No one touches you. No one questions you." Gwen looked at the silver dagger in Thomas's hand, then up into Arthur's golden eyes. A flicker of recognition passed through her. She felt the bond too, the terrifying, undeniable pull between them. "I accept your bargain, Alpha," Gwen rasped, her voice dripping with reluctant venom. "But swear it on your blood. If a single one of your dogs steps out of line, I won't just leave. I'll take your head with me." Arthur sliced his palm with his own claw, letting the blood drip onto the highland soil. "Sworn on my blood." Thomas stared at Arthur, as if his alpha had lost his mind. "You are bringing a demon into our home, Arthur. This will be the end of the Blackwood pack." Chapter 4: Into the Fog. If Blackwood Moor was a place of wild, screaming winds, Blackwood Keep was a tomb of suffocating silence. The ancient stone fortress loomed out of the freezing fog like a jagged tooth. Moss and black ivy clung to its high, narrow walls, and the iron-reinforced gates groaned as Arthur led his battered hunting party into the courtyard. The news had travelled faster than the horses. By the time Arthur dismounted, his chest wrapped in bloody bandages beneath his torn shirt, half the pack had gathered. Elders wrapped in heavy furs stared down from the stone balconies, their murmurs sounding like the clicking of dry beetle wings. At the center of the courtyard stood Elder McInnes, a man whose hair had turned the color of Highland frost, his eyes milky with age but sharp with political malice. "You return wounded, Alpha," McInnes said, his voice echoing off the damp stone walls. "And you bring an uninvited guest to our hearth." Gwen walked a step behind Arthur, draped in his oversized black wool cloak. She didn't look like a prisoner. She held her chin high, her ice-blue eyes scanning the high parapets, measuring the arches, calculating escape routes. When McInnes looked at her, she bared her teeth in a silent, feral promise. "She is not a guest, Elder," Arthur said, his voice flat and unyielding as he stepped into the light of the courtyard torches. "She is an asset. The thing that attacked our scouts on the northern ridge was slain tonight. She delivered the killing blow." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Thomas, his arm in a sling, stepped forward. "She is a winter-born Elder, a rogue from the cursed bloodline." The courtyard erupted into a cacophony of snarls and protests. Several younger warriors stepped forward, hands dropping to the pommels of their silver-edged swords. Arthur didn't roar. He didn't shift. He simply let his alpha aura flare, a heavy, suffocating wave of dominant pressure that swept across the courtyard like a physical blow. The air grew dense. The younger wolves choked, their knees buckling under the sheer weight of his genetic authority. Even McInnes took a clumsy step back, his jaw tightening. "My word is law," Arthur whispered, yet the sound carried to every corner of the keep. "She stays under my personal guard. Anyone who touches her answers to my claws. Thomas, see to the wounded and double the watchers on the southern wall. The thing we killed tonight was not alone." Arthur turned, grabbing Gwen roughly by the arm to pull her toward the grand hall, partly to maintain the illusion that she was his captive, but mostly because the moment his skin touched hers through the gap in the cloak, the mating bond flared to life again. The agonizing, beautiful heat rushed up his arm, soothing the burning poison in his chest. Gwen stiffened but didn't fight him as he dragged her inside, slamming the heavy oak doors shut against the glaring eyes of his pack. The grand hall was drafty and shadowed, lit only by a massive roaring hearth at the far end. Portraits of long-dead alphas, men with severe faces and cruel eyes, stared down from the high walls. "You play a dangerous game, Blackwood," Gwen rasped, pulling her arm from his grip the moment they were in the shadows. She looked around the cavernous room, a mocking smile on her lips. "Your pack smells of fear. They look at you like they want to tear the throat out of their own alpha." "They are traditionalists," Arthur said, pacing toward the fire, his muscles aching from the venom still sluggishly moving through his blood. "They believe the old stories. They think your kind are demons born from the deep winter." "And what do you think?" Gwen asked, stepping closer to the fire. The orange flames caught the sharp angles of her face, turning her ice-blue eyes into pools of molten glass. She let the cloak slip slightly, exposing the jagged frostbrand on her collarbone. "Do you think I'm a demon, Arthur?" Hearing his name on her lips sent a jolt straight to his core. He stopped pacing. The distance between them felt too vast, yet entirely too small. The fated mate bond was a physical pressure in the room, demanding he bridge the gap, demanding he claim her right there on the stone floor. "I think you're a survivor," Arthur said softly, his golden eyes locking onto hers. "And right now you're the only one who knows how to kill the things outside my gates. Tomorrow at dawn, we ride to the northern bogs. You will show me where they breed." Gwen stared at him, her defensive posture cracking for just a fraction of a second, as she too felt the overwhelming pull of the bond. But just as quickly, the walls came back up. "Fine," she whispered, her voice rough. "But I don't sleep in a dungeon, Alpha. If I'm going to save your people, I sleep where I can see the door." Arthur looked at the grand staircase leading to his private quarters, the only secure room in the entire castle. "You'll sleep in my chambers, under my eye." Gwen's lips curved into a dangerous, sharp smirk. "Careful, Blackwood. You might find out I bite in my sleep too. Chapter 5. The First Crack. The Alpha's quarters were as cold and unforgiving as the rest of the keep. The walls were bare stone, hung with heavy, faded tapestries to keep out the draft. A massive high-backed bed sat in the center of the room, flanked by narrow arched windows that looked out over the endless fog-drowned moor. Outside, the storm had finally broken, unleashing a torrential downpour that lashed against the glass like a handful of gravel. Arthur stood by a heavy wooden wash basin, his shirt discarded on the floor. In the flickering candlelight, the long, jagged claw marks across his chest looked ugly. The edges were swollen, weeping a faint black fluid. The venom from the creature was fighting his wolf's natural healing. Every breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. He squeezed a cloth into the freezing water and pressed it to the wound, his jaw clenching as a harsh groan escaped his teeth. "You're doing it wrong," Gwen's voice cut through the dark. She was sitting in the deep recess of the windowsill, her knees pulled to her chest, still wrapped in his black cloak. She had been completely silent for the last hour, tracking his every movement like a hawk. "I don't need your commentary, rogue," Arthur ground out, wringing the cloth out again. "I can tend to my own wounds." Gwen let out a soft, mocking snort. She slid down from the windowsill and walked toward him, her bare feet making no sound against the stone floor. As she drew closer, the fated mate bond flared to life between them, thick and heavy, making the air feel electric. "If you keep rubbing it with cold water, the poison will freeze in your veins and your heart will stop by morning," she said, stopping just inches from him. Up close, she didn't smell like the other women of his pack. There was no scent of lavender or expensive soaps. She smelled of rain, wild heather, and a sharp metallic note of ozone. It was intoxicating. Before he could push her away, she reached out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her skin burning hot against his. "Let me," she whispered. Her ice-blue eyes locked onto his, defying him to argue. Arthur's inner wolf went completely still, purring at her touch. Slowly, against his better judgment, his hand dropped to his side. Gwen stepped into his space, her chest almost touching his bare torso. She didn't use the cloth. Instead, she closed her eyes, and a faint silver light began to pulse beneath the skin of her palms, the forgotten wild magic of the winter-born. She pressed her bare hands directly over the bloody tracks on his chest. Arthur gasped, his hands flying up to grip her waist as a violent jolt of pure ecstasy shot through his system. The pain didn't just fade, it vanished. The black ooze evaporated from his skin into a faint wisp of steam, and his torn flesh began to knit back together beneath her warm palms. But as the healing magic did its work, the physical contact became too much. The fated mate bonds snapped tight around them like a vice. Arthur's grip on her waist tightened, pulling her flush against his hard chest. Gwen's breath hitched, her silver magic sputtering out as her eyes snapped open. The hostility in her gaze was gone, replaced by a dark, breathless wonder. Her hands remained pressed against his heart, which was hammering wildly. "Why are you helping me?" Arthur rasped, his voice dropping into a deep, gravelly register. His eyes flicked down to her lips, then back to her eyes. "Your ancestors hated mine. You should want me dead." "I do want you dead," Gwen whispered, though her voice lacked any real venom. She was trembling slightly, caught in the same intoxicating current as him. "But I won't let a mindless abomination take my kill." "Is that all this is?" Arthur stepped forward, forcing her back until her spine hit the heavy wood of the washstand. He leaned in close, his breath fanning across her cheek. "Just a kill?" Gwen's gaze grew fierce, her pride fighting the overwhelming urge to surrender to the bond. "Don't mistake a curse for a blessing, Alpha. The moon might have tied our souls together, but look around you. Your pack wants my head on a spike, and my pack was slaughtered by your bloodline. We are a tragedy waiting to happen." Chapter 5. The First Crack. The Alpha's quarters were as cold and unforgiving as the rest of the keep. The walls were bare stone, hung with heavy, faded tapestries to keep out the draft. A massive, high-backed bed sat in the center of the room, flanked by narrow, arched windows that looked out over the endless, fog-drowned moor. Outside, the storm had finally broken, unleashing a torrential downpour that lashed against the glass like a handful of gravel. Arthur stood by a heavy wooden wash basin, his shirt discarded on the floor. In the flickering candlelight, the long, jagged claw marks across his chest looked ugly. The edges were swollen, weeping a faint black fluid. The venom from the creature was fighting his wolf's natural healing. Every breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. He squeezed a cloth into the freezing water and pressed it to the wound, his jaw clenching as a harsh groan escaped his teeth. "You're doing it wrong," Gwen's voice cut through the dark. She was sitting in the deep recess of the windowsill, her knees pulled to her chest, still wrapped in his black cloak. She had been completely silent for the last hour, tracking his every movement like a hawk. "I don't need your commentary, rogue," Arthur ground out, wringing the cloth out again. "I can tend to my own wounds." Gwen let out a soft, mocking snort. She slid down from the windowsill and walked toward him, her bare feet making no sound against the stone floor. As she drew closer, the fated mate bond flared to life between them, thick and heavy, making the air feel electric. "If you keep rubbing it with cold water, the poison will freeze in your veins, and your heart will stop by morning," she said, stopping just inches from him. Up close, she didn't smell like the other women of his pack. There was no scent of lavender or expensive soaps. She smelled of rain, wild heather, and a sharp metallic note of ozone. It was intoxicating. Before he could push her away, she reached out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her skin burning hot against his. "Let me," she whispered. Her ice-blue eyes locked onto his, defying him to argue. Arthur's inner wolf went completely still, purring at her touch. Slowly, against his better judgment, his hand dropped to his side. Gwen stepped into his space, her chest almost touching his bare torso. She didn't use the cloth. Instead, she closed her eyes, and a faint silver light began to pulse beneath the skin of her palms. The forgotten, wild magic of the Winterborn. She pressed her bare hands directly over the bloody tracks on his chest. Arthur gasped, his hands flying up to grip her waist as a violent jolt of pure ecstasy shot through his system. The pain didn't just fade, it vanished. The black ooze evaporated from his skin into a faint wisp of steam, and his torn flesh began to knit back together beneath her warm palms. But as the healing magic did its work, the physical contact became too much. The fated mate bond snapped tight around them like a vice. Arthur's grip on her waist tightened, pulling her flush against his hard chest. Gwen's breath hitched, her silver magic sputtering out as her eyes snapped open. The hostility in her gaze was gone, replaced by a dark, breathless wonder. Her hands remained pressed against his heart, which was hammering wildly. "Why are you helping me?" Arthur rasped, his voice dropping into a deep, gravelly register. His eyes flicked down to her lips, then back to her eyes. "Your ancestors hated mine. You should want me dead." "I do want you dead," Gwen whispered, though her voice lacked any real venom. She was trembling slightly, caught in the same intoxicating current as him. "But I won't let a mindless abomination take my kill." "Is that all this is?" Arthur stepped forward, forcing her back until her spine hit the heavy wood of the washstand. He leaned in close, his breath fanning across her cheek. "Just a kill?" Gwen's gaze grew fierce, her pride fighting the overwhelming urge to surrender to the bond. "Don't mistake a curse for a blessing, Alpha. The moon might have tied our souls together, but look around you. Your pack wants my head on a spike, and my pack was slaughtered by your bloodline. We are a tragedy waiting to happen." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. She was right. The moment his pack discovered what she was to him, a civil war would rip Blackwood Keep apart. Slowly, reluctantly, Arthur let his hands slide off her waist. He stepped back, the sudden coldness between them feeling like a physical ache. "Get some sleep," Arthur said, turning his back to her as he walked toward the hearth. "We ride for the northern bogs at first light. And whatever happens out there, don't look back." Gwen didn't answer. She climbed onto the far side of the massive bed, pulling the furs over herself, her back turned to him. Arthur sat in the heavy armchair by the fire, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, watching her dark silhouette until the embers burned down to ash. Chapter 6: Betrayal from Within. The northern bogs were where the earth went to die. By dawn the downpour had ceased, leaving behind a sky the color of dirty pewter, and a fog so thick it felt like swallowing wet wool. The ground beneath the horses' hooves shifted and groaned, a treacherous labyrinth of black peat and hidden sinkholes that could swallow a beast whole. Arthur rode at the front, his posture rigid, his golden eyes scanning the horizon. Beside him, Gwen sat astride a rugged Highland mare, her dark hair bound back, her ice-blue eyes fixed on the twisting patches of heather. Thomas and 3 senior warriors brought up the rear, their weapons drawn, their silence heavy with resentment. "We've been tracking for hours, Alpha," Thomas muttered, his voice tight as he pulled his horse up alongside Arthur's. The scent out here is nothing but stagnant water and rot. The rogue is leading us into a trap. Gwen didn't even look back at him. If I wanted to trap you, Blackwood, I wouldn't waste my time bringing you to a bog. I'd just let you stay in your drafty castle until the rot ate you from the inside out. Watch your tongue, woman, Thomas began, his hand dropping to his silver dagger. Enough, Arthur commanded, his voice a low vibration that cut through the wet air. He looked at Gwen. Where is it? Gwen reined her horse to a stop at the edge of a deep, sunken ravine. Here, this is where the trail changes. Arthur dismounted, his boots sinking into the wet moss. He walked to the edge of the pit and knelt. The air here didn't just smell like rot. It smelled like the foul, metallic black ooze from the creature they had killed in the chapel. But as he brushed aside a layer of dead ferns, his breath caught in his throat. There were tracks. Massive, clawed prints belonging to the aberrations. But right beside them, deeply embedded in the black mud, were the unmistakable prints of heavy leather riding boots. Human boots. Or rather, a werewolf in human form. These are fresh, Arthur whispered, his mind racing. Someone was here. Less than an hour ago. And they weren't running from the monsters, Gwen said, walking up beside him, her scent of rain and ozone cutting through the stench of the bog. She pointed to a discarded piece of parchment caught in the brambles. They were guiding them. Arthur snatched the parchment. It was a map of Blackwood Keep's patrol routes, detailing the exact times the guard shifted, and where the defenses were weakest. At the bottom of the page was a seal pressed into dark red wax, a howling wolf encircled by frost, the winter-born crest. Thomas marched over, shoving his way past Gwen to look at the paper. A triumphant, vicious sneer twisted his face. I knew it! The winter-born are raising these demons to finish what they started a century ago. She's the spy. He lunged forward, grabbing Gwen by the front of her tunic. You brought them right to our gates. Get your hands off me, Gwen snarled, her eyes flashing a blinding, feral blue as her claws erupted from her fingertips, slicing across Thomas's leather gauntlet. Thomas, release her! Arthur roared, but before he could step between them, a terrifying sound echoed from the depths of the ravine. It was a chorus of shrieks, high-pitched, wet, and grating. The fog around them began to boil. Out of the mist, not one, but 4 of the skeletal, pale-skinned aberrations crawled over the lip of the ravine, their featureless faces turning toward the hunting party, their split jaws snapping with needle-like teeth. But they didn't lunge blindly. They moved in perfect, military synchronization, forming a semicircle to cut off the horses. And standing directly behind them, cloaked in a heavy black riding coat, was a figure whose face was obscured by a deep hood. You should have stayed in your castle, Arthur. A familiar, raspy voice echoed from beneath the hood. The figure reached up and pulled back the cloth. Arthur's heart stopped. It wasn't a winter-born survivor, it was Elder McInnes. The old man smiled, his milky eyes gleaming with a mad, desperate ambition. Your bloodline is weak, boy. Your father let this estate crumble, and you harbor our ancient enemies. The Blackwood Pack needs a leader who understands that power isn't given, it's taken. Meet my new vanguard. With a wave of McInnes' hand, the 4 monsters let out a deafening screech and lunged. Chapter 7. Exposed. The bog erupted into a chaotic symphony of violence. The first aberration lunged directly for Arthur, its skeletal limbs moving with terrifying, unnatural speed. Arthur didn't waste time shifting. He drew his broadsword, the ancient steel catching the dull grey light of the sky. With a brutal upward arc he sliced through the creature's extended arm. Black ooze hissed as it sprayed across the wet moss, but the monster didn't even flinch. It used its remaining arm to backhand Arthur across the face, sending him crashing into the mud. Arthur! Gwen screamed. She exploded into her silver-grey wolf form, leaping over a rotting log, to intercept a second monster that was barreling toward Thomas. Her jaws clamped around the creature's throat, dragging it down into the peat. Thomas, frozen in shock, stared at the unfolding horror. He looked from Gwen, who was desperately defending him, to Elder McInnes, who stood calmly at the edge of the ravine, a cold, detached smile on his wrinkled face. Elder, why? Thomas choked out, his voice cracking with betrayal. You swore to protect the pack. You told us the rogue was the danger. The rogue is a danger, you fool. McInnes spat, his voice cutting through the sounds of snapping bone and screeching monsters. But she is also the perfect scapegoat. When the Alpha is found dead, torn apart by winter-born beasts, the pack will look to me to lead them. I will purify our bloodline. I will make Blackwood feared again. McKinney raised a hand, and the two remaining aberrations surged forward, ignoring the warriors and heading straight for Arthur, who was struggling to stand as the toxic mud slowed his movements. "Kill him," McKinney commanded. Gwen saw them moving toward Arthur. The fated mate bond inside her violently rebelled at the sight of her mate in danger. With a frantic, powerful heave, she tore the head off the monster beneath her and bolted across the bog. She didn't care about the risk, she didn't care about the other warriors, she only cared about the midnight black wolf who held a piece of her soul. She intercepted the lead creature, just as its claws touched Arthur's shoulder. The impact sent both Gwen and the monster tumbling down the slippery slope of the ravine. "Gwen!" Arthur roared, shifting into his massive black wolf form in a flash of blinding light. His golden eyes blazed with a terrifying primal fury, the raw power of a true alpha unlocked inside him, burning away the lethargy of the bog. He spun on the final aberration, his jaws clamping down on its skull with enough force to shatter stone. The creature liquefied into black mist instantly. Arthur surged to the edge of the ravine, ready to dive in after Gwen, but a sharp shout stopped him. "Arthur, watch out!" It was Thomas. The beta had finally found his courage. He threw himself in front of Arthur just as McInnes raised a heavy, silver-loaded flintlock pistol. The gun cracked, the sound echoing like thunder across the moor. Thomas gasped, a silver slug catching him in the thigh. He collapsed into the heather, groaning in agony. McInnes cursed, frantically trying to reload the primitive weapon, but Arthur was already moving. He shifted back to human form, his face a mask of absolute fury as he closed the distance in 2 massive strides. He grabbed McInnes by the throat, lifting the old man completely off the ground. "You betrayed your own blood," Arthur growled, his voice vibrating with the terrifying resonance of an alpha's judgment. "You killed my men," McInnes choked, a bloody smile stretching across his lips. "It's too late, boy, the pack already knows. I left word with the council. If I don't return by dusk, they will hunt the rogue and the alpha who protects her." With a flick of his wrist, McInnes pulled a small glass vial from his pocket and smashed it on the ground. A cloud of thick, choking silver dust exploded into Arthur's face. Arthur gasped, his throat burning, his eyes blindingly painful as he dropped the old man. Coughing violently, he fell to his knees, his vision blurring into shadows. Through the haze, he heard the frantic splashing of boots as McInnes scrambled away into the dense fog. "Alpha!" Thomas wheezed from the mud, clutching his silver-poisoned leg. He looked up at Arthur, the hatred in his eyes completely gone, replaced by a profound, sobering realization. She saved me. The Winterborn. She didn't bring them." Arthur forced himself to stand, wiping the burning silver dust from his eyes. He didn't look in the direction McInnes had fled. Instead, he slid down the slippery mud of the ravine, his heart hammering against his ribs. At the bottom, Gwen was shifting back into human form, leaning heavily against the rock wall. The monster she had fought lay dead beside her, but she was bleeding from a deep gash on her ribs. She looked up at him, her ice-blue eyes wide and breathless. "He's gone," Arthur said, kneeling beside her. Without hesitating, he pulled her into his arms. The moment their skin met, the bond flared, instantly soothing the burning silver in his lungs and stopping the bleeding on her ribs. "He's heading back to the keep to turn the entire pack against us." Thomas crawled to the edge of the ravine, looking down at them. His breath hitched as he saw the unmistakable, divine glow of the fated mate bond pulsing between the alpha and the rogue. "By the ancestors," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. "She's your mate?" Arthur looked up, his golden eyes locking onto his beta. "She is. And by sunset, my own people will be hunting us like dogs." Chapter 8. The Alpha's Choice. The fog had turned a deep, bruised violet by the time they reached the southern ridge. Thomas was slumped over the saddle of Arthur's horse, his face the color of skimmed milk. The silver slug in his thigh was turning his veins a sickly neon black. He wouldn't last the night without the pack healer's antitoxins, remedies locked deep inside the heavily guarded vaults of Blackwood Keep. "We can't go back there, Arthur," Gwen rasped, her hand pressed against his chest to steady herself as they navigated a steep, rocky pass. "McInnes has already poisoned their minds. If we show our faces, they'll execute us before you can even open your mouth." "I am the Alpha," Arthur ground out, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. "They cannot simply ignore my bloodline." They can if they think your bloodline is cursed, Gwen countered, stopping him in his tracks. She stepped in front of him, her ice blue eyes fierce and demanding. Look at me. Look at what I am. You think they'll listen to a man who mated with a ghost? With the very monster they've been taught to hate since birth? The word mated hung heavy in the freezing air. The bond between them was no longer a quiet hum. It was a roaring furnace. Every time the wind whipped her scent toward him, Arthur's inner wolf demanded he carry her away, deep into the uncharted highlands where no pack laws could touch them. Alpha. Thomas's weak voice broke the tension. He choked on a breath, his fingers clawing at the horse's mane. The ridge, look at the ridge. Arthur and Gwen scrambled to the crest of the hill, crouching low behind a cluster of gorse bushes. Below them, Blackwood Keep looked like a fortress under siege, but the enemy was already inside. The iron gates were wide open. Huge, flickering bonfires had been lit in the courtyard, casting long, monstrous shadows against the stone walls. Even from this distance they could hear the frantic clanging of the alarm bells and the terrified echoing screams of women and pups. McInnes hadn't just gone back to turn the pack against them, he had lost control of his own creation. Dozens of the pale, skeletal aberrations were scaling the outer walls, dragging sentries from the parapets. The very vanguard McInnes had raised to secure his power was now systematically tearing the Blackwood pack to pieces. The old fool, Gwen whispered, her breath hitching. He thought he could command a demon. They don't want a master, Arthur, they just want to feed. Arthur watched as a massive explosion of sparks erupted from the main barracks. His people, his elders, his amigas, the children he had sworn a sacred oath to protect, were being cornered in the grand hall. He closed his eyes. A devastating choice lay before him. He could take Gwen, take the horses, and run. They could disappear into the misty mountains, living a wild, free life on the fringes of the world, bound together by a love that defied history. Or he could go back into that meat grinder, risk her life, and fight a battle where his own people might still try to kill him. Arthur, Gwen said softly. Her hand slid into his, her fingers intertwining with his. The lightning jolt of the bond hit him, but this time, it brought an absolute, sobering clarity. You're an alpha. You can't run. Arthur looked down at her, his golden eyes burning with a fierce, quiet emotion. If I go back as an outlaw, and I won't risk your life for a pack that called for your execution. You aren't risking my life, Gwen said, her lips curving into a sharp, defiant smile that made his heart ache. I'm a winterborn, remember? We don't die easily. Besides, I owe that old man a very personal debt. Arthur turned to Thomas, who was watching them with wide, tear-stained eyes. Thomas, Arthur commanded, his voice dropping into the deep, authoritative register of a leader who had finally found his purpose. Can you ride? For you, Alpha, until my heart stops, Thomas whispered. Good. Ride to the western borders. Gather any loyalists who survived the patrols. Tell them their Alpha hasn't abandoned them. Arthur drew his broadsword, the steel singing in the twilight. He looked at Gwen, his inner wolf letting out a low, echoing howl of anticipation. We're going to take back our home. Chapter 9. The Siege of Blackwood. The secret passage beneath the keep smelled of stagnant water and old victories. It was a narrow, stone artery built by Arthur's ancestors for a quick escape, but tonight, it was the only way back in. Arthur led the way, his broadsword drawn, his golden eyes cutting through the absolute pitch black. Gwen moved right behind him, her breathing shallow but steady. The fated mate bond was a coiled spring between them, vibrating with a tense, chaotic energy. They didn't need words. They could feel each other's heartbeats, each other's terror, and each other's absolute resolve. They emerged through a trick panel behind a heavy tapestry in the grand hall. The sight that greeted them was a vision of hell. The great hall, once a symbol of the pack's enduring history, was in ruins. The massive oak tables were smashed into kindling. The portraits of Arthur's ancestors were torn to shreds, splattered with black ooze and crimson blood. Trapped at the far end of the hall, behind a makeshift barricade of iron benches, were the survivors, mostly amigas, elders, and terrified children. Standing in front of them, his hands shaking, as he held a silver-tipped spear, was Elder McInnes. His pristine black coat was torn, and his eyes were wide with a mad, frantic panic. 3 of the pale skeletal aberrations were slowly circling the barricade, their featureless faces twitching, their split jaws dripping with hunger. They had ignored McInnes's commands entirely. He wasn't their master. He was just a cornered meal. "Please," McInnes shrieked, thrusting his spear blindly as one of the creatures took a step forward. "Back! I am the one who woke you. I am the one who gave you the blood." The monster let out that familiar, wet, grating shriek, its long limbs tensing to spring. Arthur didn't hesitate. With a feral roar, he surged out from behind the tapestry, shifting into his massive midnight black wolf mid-stride. He hit the lead aberration with the force of a falling boulder, his jaws snapping shut around its neck and tearing it away from the barricade. A collective gasp echoed from the trapped pack members. "The Alpha!" someone screamed. "Arthur has returned!" Before the other two monsters could react, a blur of silver-gray fur exploded into the room. Gwen vaulted over a broken table, her claws extended, driving a second creature directly into the roaring hearth. The beast shrieked as the flames ignited its oily black flesh, filling the room with a sickening chemical stench. The final aberration turned on Arthur, its obsidian claws slashing downward. Arthur dodged, but the creature's speed was monstrous. It grazed his shoulder, throwing him against the stone wall. It reared back for a killing blow. Thwack! A silver-tipped arrow sprouted from the creature's eye socket. It staggered, letting out a gurgling cry. Arthur flicked his gaze to the main entrance of the hall. Thomas stood there, leaning heavily against the doorframe for support, a heavy hunting bow in his hands. Behind him stood a dozen battle-worn Blackwood warriors, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. "For the Alpha!" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion but bursting with defiance. The warriors surged into the room, falling upon the wounded aberration with silver blades and heavy axes. Within moments the creature was reduced to a smoking puddle of black mist. Silence descended on the grand hall, broken only by the heavy panting of wolves and the soft whimpering of the children. Arthur shifted back to his human form, his chest heaving, his body covered in soot and black ooze. He didn't look at his warriors, he didn't look at the cheering amigas. His eyes locked onto Gwen, who was shifting back as well, her dark hair falling wild around her shoulders, her ice-blue eyes fixed entirely on him. Slowly, Arthur walked toward her. In front of the entire traditionalist conservative Blackwood pack, he reached out and took her hand. The divine, golden glow of the fated mate bond flared between them, illuminating the dark, ruined hall. The pack elders gasped. Murmurs broke out. "A Winterborn," someone whispered in horror. "His mate is a Winterborn." "She is," Arthur said, his voice ringing with a power so absolute it made the stone walls vibrate. He turned to face his people, still holding Gwen's hand tightly. "She is a Winterborn. And she just saved your children. She just bled for your survival while the man you trusted brought these demons to your door." Arthur's gaze snapped to Elder McInnes, who was trying to slip away through the shadows of the back corridor. "Thomas," Arthur growled, "bring him to me." Chapter 10. A New Dawn. The rain had returned, but it no longer felt like a curse. It washed the black ooze from the cobblestones of the courtyard, clearing the heavy, toxic scent of the aberrations from the mountain air. The entire Blackwood pack was gathered in a massive semicircle. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the torches and the rhythmic drip of water from the high parapets. At the center of the courtyard stood Arthur, his black cloak soaked, his golden eyes cold and unyielding. Beside him stood Gwen. She had refused to change into traditional pack garments. She still wore her rugged tunic, her dark hair wet against her face, the jagged Winterborn brand proudly exposed on her collarbone. Between them, forced onto his knees in the wet dirt, was Elder McInnes. His hands were bound in heavy silver chains, the very chains he had meant for Gwen. "You have been weighed by the laws of the ancestors, McInnes," Arthur said, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. "You practiced dark magic. You conspired with abominations, and you spilled the blood of your own pack brothers for a crown that did not belong to you. What say you?" McInnes spat blood onto the cobblestones, his face twisting into a bitter, pathetic sneer. He looked past Arthur, glaring directly at Gwen. "You think you've won, boy? Look at what you stand next to. A monster. A remnant of the pack that slaughtered our kin. If you take her into your bed, the bloodline will rot. The pack will fail." The pack was already rotting, McInnes. A voice called out. Thomas stepped forward from the crowd. His leg was heavily bandaged, but his posture was straight, his eyes clear. "We lived in fear of old bedtime stories while a traitor sat on our council. This monster bled to save my life. She bled to save your grandchildren. If that is what a Winterborn is, then our ancestors were liars." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Old elders nodded their heads, young mothers clutched their children tightly, their eyes filled with gratitude as they looked at Gwen. Arthur drew his broadsword, the ancient steel gleaming in the torchlight. He didn't look at McInnes as he raised the blade. By the authority vested in my blood and by the consensus of the pack, I sentence you to exile. If you or any who follow you ever set foot on Blackwood Moor again, your life is forfeit. McInnes gasped, his face draining of color. For a werewolf, exile from the pack was a fate worse than death. It meant wandering the world as a nameless, packless ghost, rejected by the earth itself. 2 heavy guards stepped forward, dragging the weeping old man to his feet, and shoving him out into the freezing, misty dark beyond the iron gates. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him, locking him out forever. Arthur sheathed his sword, the tension in his shoulders finally dissipated. He turned to face his people, but more importantly, he turned to face Gwen. The fated mate bond between them pulled hard, a sweet, overwhelming warmth that made his inner wolf howl with joy. He reached out, his hand sliding behind her neck, his thumb brushing the soft skin right below her ear. The old traditions died tonight, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a softer, warmer register that was meant only for her, though the silent pack heard every word. We cannot build a future if we are constantly running from the ghosts of our past. He looked back out at the crowd, raising his voice. I gave this woman a bargain. I promised her asylum. But the moon has given us something greater. She is not a prisoner, nor is she a guest. She is my mate. She is your Luna. A brief, breathless silence hung over the courtyard. Then, Thomas dropped to one knee, bowing his head in absolute respect. Long live the Alpha, Thomas shouted. Long live the Luna. One by one, the warriors dropped to their knees, then the elders, then the Omegas. Within moments the entire Blackwood pack was bowing, accepting the rogue wolf into their hearts, rewriting a century of hatred with a single gesture of submission. Gwen looked around the courtyard, her ice-blue eyes wide with a rare, vulnerable wonder. The walls she had built around her heart over a decade of isolation were crumbling down, piece by piece. She looked up at Arthur, a brilliant, breathtaking smile breaking across her face. You're a madman, Arthur Blackwood, she whispered, her fingers tangling in the front of his shirt, pulling him down to her. You've completely ruined my reputation as a terrifying rogue. Consider it my first act as your alpha, Arthur murmured. He leaned down and kissed her. The contact was explosive. A collision of lightning and fire that sealed the bond completely. The golden glow of their combined aura flared outward, cutting through the dense Scottish fog, illuminating the courtyard in a brilliant, beautiful light. The ghosts of Blackwood Moor were finally at peace. A new dawn had begun. And so, the fog clears over Blackwood Keep, leaving behind a pack reborn in the ashes of the old world. Arthur and Gwen's story may have reached its dawn, but the wilds of the Highlands are vast, and many more secrets lie hidden in the dark. Thank you so much for listening. If you felt the pull of the fated mate bond, and want to hear more thrilling werewolf romances, dark fantasy, and gothic tales, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our next story. Don't forget to hit that like button, and share this video with your fellow romance lovers. It helps the pack grow. And finally, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me your favorite moment, or what kind of romance world we should venture into next. Until the next moon rises, stay wild.